Good morning. We do have several visitors this morning, and we're always glad for that. We have a number of people who are out as well for different reasons. Some of them physical problems and some traveling in a way, and we missed them all this morning. But we're glad for each of you, of course. The text was read from John 5, 1 through 9. So I'll ask you to open your New Testaments to that passage once again. And I want us to focus on verse 6 this morning. And the question that Jesus asked the man that we would call a paraplegic in verse 6. Do you want to be made well? And I'm approaching it this morning a little bit from the standpoint that strikes us as something of a strange question. To ask somebody in this guy's condition, who had been this way for, the text tells us, 38 years, do you want to be made well? And most of us would think, well, sure. I mean, why would you ask a question like that? Who wouldn't want to be made well or healed in a similar situation? So, we think it's a given, but think about it for just a moment. Have you ever known somebody taken to the hospital against their will? I have. Have you ever been taken to the hospital against your will? I don't know, possibly. Have you ever known someone in the hospital to walk out of the hospital, AMA, against medical advice? I have. I would imagine you have too. Now, I ask you those questions simply to try to put this question into a little perspective for the rest of us. Sometimes people do not want what we think they might want. Somebody's sick. We think they need to go to the hospital. They don't want to go to the hospital. They're in the hospital. They don't appreciate or like the treatment that they're getting. They're frustrated. They want out. They walk out. Now, sometimes I can understand situations like that. Sometimes I can't understand that. So it's relative, I suppose, in that regard. So here's a guy in John 5, who is, again, what we would call a paraplegic. And he has suffered with this condition for 38 years. And Jesus asked him the question, do you want to be made well? Well, there are some things to think about here in regard to all of this. And there are a few truths that I want to try to bring out of this passage for us to think about and hopefully learn from and maybe improve our lives just a little bit, I hope. Let's take the question in verse 6. Just string it out a little bit. Do you want to be made well? And let's think about the question. Let's break it up into three thoughts. Number one, do you want to be made well? You. The Lord directed the question specifically to the party involved. You. Okay? So let's try to personalize this a little bit this morning, best we can. You, not somebody else. I know how we are. We care about other people. We have other people under our care, maybe in our home or in our family, maybe a spouse, maybe a parent, somebody else. You are obligated and you are responsible and you care for them. That may mean that you're watching over them all the time. That may mean that you pay for them, you pray for them, you put up with them, you protect them, whatever it takes. You are watching out for them. Now, yes, we care about others. But Jesus asked this guy, do you want to be made well? And sometimes the people that we care about so much don't care so much for themselves. Let's put a spiritual context to this, if we might. You have friends that you care about. You want them to learn about the Lord. You want them to understand truth and to obey the truth. You talk to them. You encourage them. Maybe you bring them to worship services. Maybe you encourage them to come on their own to worship services. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. You're working on them because you care about them, but do they care about themselves? Do they care enough to internalize what you are trying to do? Because the gospel appeals to people personally. We're trying to get people to think about their own situation. Because the fact is, as Paul stated in 2 Corinthians 5:10, we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the things that we have done. Good or bad. Weighed in the balances like that. So that's something that I have to think about. I appreciate your concern. Anybody else, I appreciate that. But I have to think about me. Because that's where the truth comes, it appeals to us personally. And in Romans 6:17, we have to obey from the heart that form of teaching which is delivered us. So that teaching may be delivered from all manner of sources, people like you, but yet I have to obey it from the heart. So I have to do something, you see. So this question has a personal element to it. Do you? Now, this thought hit me as I was seated down here next to my lovely bride. How many of us this morning would be here were it not for the person sitting next to you? Now, this won't apply to everybody. I understand that. But given that scenario, would you be here were it not for somebody else? If it were just up to you to get up, get dressed, get ready, and get out, would you be here? Some of us yes, some of us no. Do you want to be made well? Emphasis is very personal. But let's move it on just a little bit. Do you want to be made well? All right. Some of us need to get our want to fixed. We understand that, don't we? Not everybody wants what we think they should want. They don't want the same thing you want. I mean, somebody may be in a desperate situation, physically speaking and every other way, and you know they need to do something about it, and you appeal to them constantly to do something, and they don't, because they don't want to. I mean, look at every addict that's out there, and regardless of You name the substance, it doesn't matter what it is. The addict, does he or she want to get away from that thing? That's what it takes. And we tell them, you've got to want to. That's the first step. That's not all that's involved, but it's a step. Do you want to be made well? Well, obviously he wanted to be made well. But there was a situation. He couldn't do much about it. There was a pool here, and there are people of all kinds of problems gathered around. And he couldn't get in for the push of other people ahead of him. And he was kind of in a desperate situation. Yes, he wanted, but there wasn't much he could do about it. So, do you want to be made well? Let's move that again into a little bit of a spiritual perspective. We wish that everybody wanted to obey the gospel. Why don't they? Do they not understand it? I mean, in this scenario, I'll come back to the spiritual thing here in a moment. But in this scenario, Jesus asked the guy, "Do you want to be made?" Well, you know, there's a psychological element involved here that maybe we read into it, I don't know, but this guy would have to make some changes if he really wanted to be made well. He'd have to do some things differently. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, he would have to go to work and support himself and pay his bills. He would have to provide for himself. Others have been doing that. He would have to take himself off the victim list. Was he ready to do that? Was he ready to accept a new relationship in life as one who is no longer needy, but now fully healthy and capable of taking care of himself, fending for himself? No more of this, helpless situation. Was he ready to do that? Did he want that? Now, maybe I'm reading into something that wasn't there, but the Lord got his attention by asking this question. Do you want to be made well? Nobody had ever asked him that question before. So, again, in a spiritual perspective, we wish everybody wanted to be made well. We wish that they would want the gospel. Sadly, they don't. And Jesus put it this way in Matthew 7 verse 13. Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to life, and few there be that find it. Few people want it. Why is that? That's difficult for me to understand that. And yet, that's the nature of the case. So again, we have to want things in order to make changes, effective changes. And if we don't ever come to the point of wanting something better than what we've got, then we're stuck in this situation for the rest of our lives. So that's the human picture of all of this, and we understand that very well. And then going back to the question here in verse 6, follow it out to its completion. Do you want to be made well? Now, the man here, afflicted with this for 38 years, this whatever it was he had, again, paraplegic, for 38 years. Do you want to be made well? Yes. And he had an idea of how that would happen. His idea of how it would happen. Look at verse 7. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But when I'm coming, another jumps in down before me. All right. His idea was first come, first serve into the pool. Now, that should not strike you as odd. Please, those of you who are old enough, you know that Warm Springs, Georgia was an attraction to FDR as a therapy for his polio. You know that Hot Springs, Arkansas was an attraction for such notables as Al Capone. For whatever reasons, a therapeutic benefit that may come from it. This is not strange. This is the way people are. There's some benefits to that. So that was his idea. But the Lord had a different idea. Jesus in verse 8 said, for all practical purpose, forget the pool, get up, take up your bed and walk. So Jesus offered him something here that he could not do for himself. Oh, well, sure, he had to get up, he had to walk, but he couldn't do that on his own except for the fact that Jesus told him to do it. And this guy didn't know who Jesus was, just a stranger in the crowd. But Jesus told him to do it. And that was enough, and he did it. And he received something that he himself could not get. Now, that's the way it is spiritually with us. Salvation is not something that we could possibly earn. We know that. It's not a merit type of thing. We understand that. We have to come to the Lord, Matthew 11, 28 through 30, in response to his invitation. In Titus 3, verses 4 and 5, we're saved by his mercy, not by anything that we've done. That doesn't enter into the picture. But yes, we have to do some things. We have to respond to him in that way in Matthew 11, 28 through 29. In Philippians 2, 9 through 12, everyone who obeys the gospel, everyone bows the knee before Jesus, figuratively or literally. They confess with the tongue Jesus as Lord. And in verse 12, in so doing, then they are working out their own salvation with fear and trembling, you understand. There's something that we must do, just like in this scenario here. Sometimes we go into nursing homes and we watch the people there. Sometimes people you know, sometimes people you don't know. And a nursing home is not everybody's favorite place to go. Why? Well, because we see people in very sad conditions. And we hear. And we smell. And we hear people, sometimes it's just sheer silence. And that's bad enough. And sometimes we hear people moaning, crying. We see people who can't feed themselves, who can't clean themselves, who can't scratch their nose when it itches, who can't turn themselves over in bed to get comfortable. And you think, can it get any worse than that? And you think, I hope I never end up that way. And yet, can it get any worse than that? The answer is yes, it can. Now, you got your Bible open to John 9. Let's read just a little bit further here. In verse 10, the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, it is the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed. He answered them, he who made me well said, take up your bed and walk. Then they asked him, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who was healed did not know who it was, For Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." That's very interesting. He was in a paraplegic condition for 38 years. And you might think, well, can it get any worse than that? And Jesus healed him and said, "Man, you've been made well. Unless you change some things, it's going to get worse for you." That's a lesson to me. Because we look, going back to the nursing home thing, we see people in situations that we don't admire. It's sad. And we think, can it get any worse than that? And the answer is yes, it can. If we don't learn the lesson with regard to sin, living a life of sin, whatever our physical condition may be, however bad it could possibly be, that's nothing compared to what could happen if we don't learn the lesson from what Jesus taught here. To give up a life of sin, because if you don't, it's going to get worse for you. How? Well, sin is separation from God, Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. Not only from God, but from people that you love, people that are close to you, relationships here, ties that we have upon earth, and our relationship to God in heaven. If we don't change, things will get worse. So, Jesus' question, strange question. Do you want to be made well? Is that a strange question? Yeah, maybe not. Because the story is not finished. It moves on, you see. And I'm reminded in Romans 8 and verse 18, Paul's thought there that for all the suffering that we experience in this life, that's nothing worthy to be compared to the glory that awaits. All right? You want to be made well this morning? I'm asking you. That's not a silly question, is it? You better think about that. The only way to be made well is to come to the great physician in response to his treatment plan, and that's the gospel, and that's now while we stand, while we sing.